metrics fall into three buckets. You have implementation measures that focus on policy. You have efficiency and effectiveness measures that focus on delivery of security services, primarily technical, and you have impact measures that look at the impact to the organization for the risk or the event occurring. And so if we take risk management as a category, because everybody in this room has to manage some kind of risk for their organization, I'm going to walk you through how you build out specific metrics related to risk management, and then you can think about other metrics. For those of you who are technology people, this that I'm doing for risk management, you could take the 20 control families from Special Publication 800-53 or Special Publication 800-171 from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In both of those documents, the control families are the same. The level of depth is different, but both security control guides have 20 control families. I just picked the risk management ones because that's going to resonate with everybody in the room, rather than picking something crazy like reverse malware analysis, and then half my audience doesn't know what we're talking about. So if we start with risk management as the objective, and we take implementation measures that are looking at policy, there are three metrics that drive performance for every organization regardless of the industry. Number one, the number of policy exceptions identified. And so you as a risk professional want to go around the company and say, given what our policy says, how many exceptions to the policy exist? A good example of policy, everybody wears their badge in the building so that I can identify employees from strangers. Well, there should be some number of people who are not following the policy so that we can figure out the number of exceptions. Exception in this context doesn't matter whether it was authorized or unauthorized. It's just a violation of the policy as documented. Our second metrics is the number of documented policy exceptions, because I do have an obligation to differentiate between the existence of an exception to the policy and whether or not it was an authorized exception. If we take what Chris talked about with child sexual abuse materials, our policy says 0 is the acceptable number. Any violation of the policy is any number of instances of child sexual abuse material. And from a risk management perspective, because CSAM is a federal crime, now we can measure the amount of exposure that exists because of the number of exceptions to the policy for a specific classification of risk item. And then our third metric for our implementation measures, where we are looking at policies that are documented, is the number of policy exceptions without formal documentation and approval. It assumes that every policy that has an exception has been formally requested, formally authorized, and somebody has signed their name. That is the ideal standard. Mathematically, when we're representing measurements in percentages, there's a lot of value from being able to say this is the total number of exceptions, and given that number, here are the number of items that exist that were not approved versus the items that exist that were approved, because every instance of a policy violation that was not authorized is an indication of a problem that then we can investigate to improve performance. What I recommend whenever you're doing measurement of performance for security, for risk management, or for anything else is that your timeframes are monthly, quarterly, and annually. If I measure it monthly, then the quarterly report is the aggregate of the last 3 months. If I do it annually, it's the aggregate of the last quarters, and now I can do fun, advanced things that we didn't talk about, like modeling the data in a histogram or using other tools like a frequency distribution to highlight what's an outlier so I know where my problems are, so I can really laser focus on things that matter. But at a minimum, you should do all performance measurement monthly, quarterly, and annually. If we're looking at impact to the organization based on the effectiveness of risk management, my 4 R's of risk, Umar is a former student, so he knows that Keon's 4 R's of risk are revenue, resilience, regulations, and reputation. Resilience relates to operational resilience for my chief operating officers in the room. And what happens is we're looking at the revenue impact of documented and undocumented exceptions on the risk profile of the organization. And then we repeat that for the other 3 out of the 4. And so what I end up with is an entire table of direct revenue impact, quarterly, monthly, annually, for every exception that was authorized and for every exception that was unauthorized. And then the direct revenue impact to the business, or the direct resilience impact for every risk exception that was authorized or unauthorized. And then I repeat for regulatory impact and reputational harm. And what I have in aggregate is a clear picture of every risk event that occurs and the impact that it has on the business. If you map it out on a table, some risk impacts are going to affect revenue and operations and regulations and reputation, Voldemort.ai. But what it allows you to do is say very clearly, because this happened, this is the impact on the organization, and we've looked at that impact in financial terms and in terms of business operations and everything else. And so this is what I had in mind when I gave you the 5 questions. Because we had extra time, because we had one less table, I thought it would be valuable for me to walk you through that. And what you ultimately end up with is about 500 metrics that you could have. So start small, focus on the things that matter, but you could build this out comprehensively for all 20 control families that NIST provides in their catalogs. I don't do maturity models. That's a different presentation. I'm writing a book that's called Maturity Models Must Die because I think they're stupid. And I don't have time to walk you through what that book says yet. But the idea is that if we move away from just doing metrics because they're in a catalog, and we focus on the legal definition of the duty of care, and I can represent with my data that I know who my stakeholder is who will be harmed, and I can communicate based on the things that I've done everything within the ability that we have, given the resources available, to prevent harm that leads to a remedy that is directed by the courts because of a lawsuit. Well, now I've put my company in a legally defensible position with justification, and that's going to drive my risk decisions rather than having a catalog of random controls that some scientists at the National Institute of Standards and Technology came up with. And so you'll get more advanced as you do this. I've been doing performance-based risk management for over a decade, and I got bored with the old stuff, so I started tinkering around with new stuff. If you have any questions, let me know.